You are listening to the Objects of Affection collection. Study 42, Material as Manifesto, the Political Legacy of Arte Povera and the Birth of Post-Luxury. The contemporary landscape of luxury is defined by a profound state of exhaustion. This is a system hollowed out by its own internal contradictions. A scarcity paradox where mass expansion and global licensing have systematically destroyed the very rarity that luxury purports to sell, and a tariff effect that has untethered price from any material reality, fueling a widespread consumer price fatigue and a quiet, psychic rebellion against conspicuous consumption, as detailed in Stressflation and Product Recalls. We are living in the endgame of a cultural economic logic, a world of pure sign value, where the logo and the image have become fully detached from any material or functional truth, as exemplified by the dynamics explored in The Monopoly on a Vibe. This crisis of value, however, is not new. It is the mature, collapsing phase of a system whose nascent, corrupting influence was first identified and radically opposed over half a century ago. This original opposition was not an academic critique but a guerrilla war. Emerging from the radical political atmosphere of 1960s Italy, the movement known as Arte Povera, literally poor art, was the first organized philosophical and material response to the colonization of culture by mass consumerism. Its artists were the first to see the objects hollowing out, and they fought back not with essays but with objects of their own. This study will definitively establish Arte Povera as the primary political, poetic, and philosophical ancestor of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Post-luxury conceptual functional art. It will demonstrate that the core tenets of Arte Povera, its visceral critique of the commercialized system, its strategic demotion of material preciousness in favor of conceptual weight, and its radical expansion of an object's function to include political witness and sensory confrontation, are the foundational blueprints for the four pillars of the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework. The rebellion that Arte Povera started was, in its time, left unfinished, but its essential project has been inherited. This report traces that lineage, arguing that post-luxury conceptual functional art is the 21st century continuation of that first vital insurrection against a culture of empty signs, the hollow miracle, a political prehistory of value. Arte Povera did not emerge in a vacuum. It was a direct and necessary response to the socio-political catalyst of post-war Italy. The nation was in the grip of the Il Miracolo Economico, the Italian economic miracle. This period of rapid, aggressive industrialization and economic growth brought unprecedented prosperity and a new, seductive consumer culture. Yet this miracle had a hollow core. The new wealth was deeply uneven, exacerbating an existing class divide and creating profound social tension. This new industrial consumerist model was largely imported, fueled by American influence via the Marshall Plan. For many Italians, this American interference felt like a new form of cultural imperialism, one that was aggressively supplanting Italy's deep-rooted cultural memory and identity with a dehumanizing logic of mass production and a superficial consumerist culture. This disillusionment was not a passive intellectual critique, it was a violent, popular rejection. The late 1960s gave way to the hot autumn, a period of widespread student and worker protests that brought the country to a standstill through strikes and social upheaval. In this charged atmosphere, the language of resistance became militant. The guerrilla strategies of revolutionary figures like Che Guevara, Mao Zedong, and North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap became potent models for a generation that believed in direct, violent action to destabilize the capitalist structure. A form of direct action echoed in contemporary interventions like the secret handshake. The hollow miracle ignited widespread social unrest, culminating in Italy's hot autumn of the late 1960s. This period of intense worker and student protests, like this demonstration outside a Fiat factory, created the charged political atmosphere that gave birth to Arte Povera. Artists and activists alike rejected the dehumanizing logic of mass production and the superficiality of imported consumer culture, embodying a guerrilla war against the very systems Arte Povera sought to dismantle. This context provides the historical analogue for the foundational pillars of post-luxury conceptual functional art. The hollow miracle created the first modern wave of mass consumer disillusionment. The visceral political rejection of this new hollow system of value by Italian students and workers is a perfect historical parallel to the contemporary post-luxury, consumers' quiet rebellion, crisis of ephemeral, and rejection of the income upgrade phenomenon. The post-luxury conceptual functional art framework identifies a modern consumer who, having achieved wealth, feels no further need to signal it, and shifts from chasing status to chasing impact and purpose. This is a post hoc rejection by an individual who has already won the game. Arte Povera, by contrast, emerged from a pre-hoc rejection, a collective political refusal to enter that system in the first place. Both movements, however, are born from the same fundamental human impulse, a critique of a system that values status over substance, which directly establishes the historical lineage for post-luxury conceptual functional arts. Pillar 1, the post-luxury movement and deconstruction of status, and Pillar 3, critique of traditional systems. Notes for a guerrilla war, a two-front assault on commodification. The political unrest of the streets found its theoretical voice in the art world. In 1967, the critic and curator Germano Celent published his Manifesto, Arte Povera, a punti per una guerriglia, notes for a guerrilla war. This text was a direct call to arms, articulating the social critique that was already boiling over. Its opening lines served as a diagnosis of the entire condition of modernity. First came man, then the system. That is the way it used to be. Now it's society that produces and it's man that consumes. This was an explicit rejection of consumerism and a critique of a capitalist system that had inverted the relationship between humanity and its creations. For Celent and the artists, the contemporary art world was a perfect microcosm of this corrupt new system. The white walls of the gallery were not neutral but exploitative commercial spaces. It was a machine for branding artists and their work for consumption, a system that, as Celent observed, reduced the artwork to a mere decorative commodity. Arte Povera artists sought to challenge and disrupt this entire commercial structure. The movement's attack on this system was a precise, two-front war against the dominant American art forms that had become avatars of this new, commodified logic. Rejecting pop art, the content. Pop art was rejected for celebrating consumer culture. To the radicalized Italians, pop's ironic embrace of brands and advertising was not a critique but a gleeful surrender. It was a symptom of the very American-style materialism and sign value they were actively fighting in their streets and factories. Rejecting minimalism. The form minimalism was rejected for its industrial nature, its enthusiasm for technology, and its cold, scientific rationalism. The Arte Povera artists saw in its sleek forms the dehumanizing nature of industrialization, the logic of the factory floor. They felt it was a language unsuited to a culture trying to save its own cultural memory and identity from erasure by the machine. This dual rejection created a direct historical precedent for post-luxury conceptual functional arts. Pillar 3, critique of traditional systems. Arte Povera's holistic critique of pop, as consumerist psychology, and minimalism, as industrial production, was an attack on the entire capitalist apparatus of art. This is the same argument articulated in the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework, particularly in critiques of systemic failures like those exposed in Anatomy of a Collapse. That study's critique of the luxury system's internal contradictions mirrors Arte Povera's rejection of minimalism's industrial sensibilities and its dehumanizing logic. Both movements identify and reject a system that prioritizes industrial logic over humanistic integrity. Arte Povera waged a two-front war against the dominant American art forms of the 1960s. They rejected pop art's left, exemplified by Andy Warhol's Campbell's Soup Cans celebration of consumer culture as a surrender to sign value. Simultaneously, they critiqued minimalism's right, exemplified by Donald Judd's Untitled Stack. Cold industrial aesthetic and rationalism, seeing it as a dehumanizing extension of the factory floor. This dual rejection forms a direct historical precedent for post-luxury conceptual functional arts. Pillar 3, critique of traditional systems. Material as manifesto. The birth of value as narrative, the most radical gesture of Arte Povera was its weaponization of materials. The term poor art was not an aesthetic descriptor, but a political strategy. The deliberate, calculated use of unprecious, valueless, and everyday materials, soil, rags, twigs, coal, and steel, was an act of sabotage. It was a direct method to challenge and disrupt the values of the commercialized contemporary gallery system. The genius of this strategy was that by using materials with no intrinsic monetary worth, the artists forced the value of the work to migrate elsewhere. Value could no longer be located in the material preciousness of carved marble or cast bronze. Instead, it was forced to reside entirely in the concept, the process, and the narrative. This act rejected the commodification of art and resisted easy consumption by severing the link between price and material. It was the birth of value as narrative as a political tool. Two case studies perfectly illustrate this principle. The first is Michelangelo Pistolto's Venus of the Rags, 1967. This seminal work stages a stark, unforgettable confrontation. A cement-cast replica of a classical Venus, the ultimate symbol of high art, the Western canon, eternal beauty and aristocratic value, is turned with her back to a chaotic, haphazardly dumped pile of multicolored rags. These rags are not neutral. They are a political text. They are the symbols of detritus, cultural degradation and waste, the literal harmful effects of consumerism and the throwaway culture of the hollow miracle, a culture critiqued in Stressflation and Product Recalls. They are the discarded emblems of the underprivileged and exploited Italian laborers, whose work fueled that miracle. The value of the Venus of the Rags is 100% conceptual. It is an object that functions as a political dialogue, a reconsideration of where society locates beauty, in the idealized, canonical past, or in the discarded garbage of its own overconsumption. This is a clear historical precedent for post-luxury conceptual functional arts. Pillar 2. Narrative control as a medium. The second case study is Mario Merz's Igloo di Giap, 1968. Here, Merz uses poor materials, a metal skeleton and bags of clay to construct a primordial nomadic dwelling. The igloo itself was a symbol of resistance against a sedentary capitalist life. Merz then pierces this humble earthen structure with an element of industrial modernity, a bright neon tube, but this neon is not an advertisement, it is a weapon. It broadcasts the guerrilla war slogan from General Giap. If the enemy masses, he loses ground; if he scatters, he loses strength. This object is a perfect historical manifestation of post-luxury conceptual functional arts. Pillar 4. The creator as philosophical architect. Merz acts as a theorist, embedding a political text directly into the object's form. The work's value lies entirely in its conceptual power as a poetic and political commentary on the relationship between the individual, the single bag of clay, and the organization, the igloo structure. This is the very definition of material as story, where intentionality and narrative, not intrinsic wealth, create all value, a principle also explored in the work of Robert Ebbendorf. Function as confrontation, the poetics of the dematerialized encounter. The capstone of Arte Povera's legacy lies in its radical redefinition of function, providing the most direct lineage to the conceptual functional art component of post-luxury conceptual functional art. The artists expanded the very meaning of utility. The function of an art object was no longer decorative, aesthetic, or passive. It became political, experiential, and above all, confrontational. This redefinition began with material. In the untitled works of Janis Kounelis, he would create jarring compositions of non-art materials, such as burlap sacks, industrial steel panels, and ordinary coal. By suspending a heavy sack of coal from a steel frame, Kounelis created an anti-elitist art whose primary function was to unite art with everyday lived experience. It bypasses a purely intellectual reading and functions by appealing to all senses, forcing the viewer to confront the mass, texture, and distinctive aroma of the coal. This shifts the artwork's function from something to be seen to something to be encountered. This idea reached its apotheosis in Kounelis's untitled 12 Horses, 1969. This is the climax of the Arte Povera argument and the definitive historical precedent for post-luxury conceptual functional art's expanded definition of function. Kounelis did not place a representation of a horse in the elite El Attico gallery in Rome. He tethered 12 live horses to its walls, creating a temporary horse stable. The work was a direct, methodological appropriation of the workerism political movement. The horses, symbols of raw nature, animal energy and pre-industrial labor, were used to embody the worker's reality. The function of this installation was pure political confrontation. It was designed to force this worker's reality into the sanitized, consumerist world of the bourgeoisie, shattering the gallery's commercial and aesthetic canons. The audience's response, a mixture of awe and fear, as they navigated the smell, sound, and sheer physical presence of the animals, was the work's content. Kounelis stated he intended to explore the space's structural identity, noting, "What interested me was that the horse was part of the wall." He fused life, labor, and architecture into a single indivisible act. This piece is post-luxury conceptual functional art avant la lettre. It is conceptual, a profound critique of the gallery system and class divides. It is functional. Its function is not decorative but is a political witness and the creation of an immaterial sensory encounter. And it is post-luxury. Its not-for-sale nature made it an unownable non-commodity, a direct criticism of the commercial fetishization of the work of art. This act provides the direct, irrefutable lineage for the post-luxury conceptual functional art framework's inclusion of contemporary artists like Doris Salcedo, whose expanded function is discussed in The Immaterial Object of Witness, which defines function to include emotional labor, memory, and political witness, and Tino Sehgal, whose work is determined by the unownable moment of encounter itself. The inheritance of post-luxury, the legacy of Arte Povera, is not a style. It is a political and poetic methodology. This study has traced the lineage, demonstrating that its guerrilla war was a direct, material response to the birth of the hollow, industrialized consumerism that post-luxury conceptual functional art now critiques in its mature, collapsing phase. Rebellion that Arte Povera initiated was, at the time, left unfinished. As a movement, it was short-lived and, in a grim irony, was eventually historicized, absorbed and commodified by the very commercial art market it sought to disrupt, a process analyzed in The Missing Mass. The profound questions it raised, however, were never resolved. They have only become more urgent. Post-luxury conceptual functional art is the 21st century inheritor and, in many ways, the completion of this critical project. The lineage is clear and direct. Where Arte Povera used poor materials to sever value from their physical cost, post-luxury conceptual functional art uses narrative materials, provenance, process, philosophical intent and ethical considerations to achieve the same goal in an age of total hyperreality. Where Arte Povera critiqued the rise of the industrial creative system and its dehumanizing logic, post-luxury conceptual functional art critiques its spectacular collapse, diagnosing the calendar burnout of fashion and the state of exhaustion of luxury. Where Arte Povera radically expanded an object's function to include political confrontation and sensory encounter, post-luxury conceptual functional art internalizes this logic, defining its objects as vessels for meaning, connection, emotional labor, and political witness. As seen in The Immaterial Object of Witness, Arte Povera provides the definitive historical proof that the most powerful objects are not those that signify wealth, but those that challenge the very systems that define value. This is the foundational, political, and historical lineage upon which post-luxury conceptual functional art now builds its urgent and necessary vision for the future of value. The remainder of this study continues at objectsofaffectioncollection.com. This has been a study from the Objects of Affection Collection, a critical art research institution operating under the framework of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Read the full research at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.